How did this subtropical city become one of Australia's fastest growing regions? And how did historic planning decisions put Brisbane on the path to car dependency and urban sprawl? This video seeks to explain. Brisbane is located on the east coast of Australia and is the country's third largest city. A city that was to be never more than a village, Brisbane is now at the heart of one of Australia's fastest growing regions. Brisbane's growth has sprawled into neighbouring cities and regions, creating a 200-kilometre stretch of almost uninterrupted houses from Noosa in the north to the Gold Coast in the south. The city and region were first home to the Yagara, Turrbal and Quandamooka peoples for at least 20,000 years. The region contains several large camps, importantly including one at the contemporary city centre of Brisbane. Colonial settlers took advantage of the many paths and settlement areas first used by traditional owners, with colonial settlement patterns often replicating those first used by First Nations peoples. Development in the penal settlement was ad hoc, with early town limits at Boundary Street to the north and southwest of the city. These boundaries were used to enforce the racial segregation of the city by restricting movement of First Nations peoples. Urban development was loosely guided by regulations issued from the governor based in Sydney, and in preparation for Brisbane to be open to free settlers, a survey was conducted in 1839 by Robert Dixon, James Warner and Granville Stapleton and later modified by Henry Wade in 1841. Wade's survey contained provisions for public squares and reserves to ensure access to the river, but these were not followed, as Governor George Gipps believed Brisbane would never contain a significantly sized population. With the separation of Queensland from the New South Wales colony in 1859, local lawmakers were granted more autonomy to guide new development. The first attempt to regulate urban development in Brisbane was the Undue Subdivision of Land Prevention Act 1885. This legislation followed increasing concern about the condition of housing in inner city areas. Tenements and cottages on small parcels of land were viewed as increasing the risk of disease and fire, and the new legislation required residential dwellings to be constructed on land of at least 16 perches or 405 square metres. Preventing dwellings such as 18 Rosa Street Spring Hill, constructed on a 12-perch parcel in the mid-1870s, was the aim of this legislation, as well as preventing the construction of houses fronting a lane. As a result, most new development consisted of detached houses. This legislation also made terrace houses illegal, despite this form of dwelling being the predominant form of higher-density housing in Sydney and Melbourne at the time. This would have a fundamental impact on Brisbane's future growth. The effective ban on higher-density development made Brisbane a greener city, with residents generally having private gardens, but it also made the provision of basic urban services such as sewerage, paved roads, and street lighting prohibitively expensive. Brisbane was the last major Australian city to provide sewerage and water utilities to dwellings within its city limits, which did not occur until the late 1960s. Brisbane was also constantly congested. The introduction of trams in 1885, firstly horse-drawn and then electric, exacerbated the problem. Unlike Melbourne, the streets were not wide enough to carry traffic as well as trams. A number of acts related to town planning and transport were passed in the late 19th and early 20th century. These gave local governments more power to plan for growth. At the same time, town planning was emerging as a discipline. The initial priority of this legislation was to widen Adelaide Street. Adelaide Street, in the centre of Brisbane, was widened by over 4 metres between 1924 and 1931. This involved the demolition and reconstruction of 31 buildings. The Undue Subdivision of Land Prevention Act 1885 was repealed in 1923. The new legislation provided local authorities with the power to specify the maximum number of houses per acre in a future subdivision of land. The minimum lot size of 16 perches was, however, explicitly retained. Minimum widths were set for roads, with principal roads, for through traffic, set at 80 feet, or 24.4 metres. This was slightly wider than the requirements under the previous legislation. The government's position at the time was to ensure local governments were not burdened with unnecessary maintenance expenditure caused by new development. The minister responsible for the legislation, Frank Brennan, spoke about profiteering by real estate speculators, stating they cannot complain they are not in a position to pay a little more for doing certain work before the land is put on the market for sale. Brisbane continued to grow and, by 1925, the amalgamation of 21 shires and councils meant Brisbane was the largest city administration area in the Southern Hemisphere. The unified local government gave Brisbane a significant opportunity for large-scale planning. When compared to Melbourne and Sydney, who continue to have multiple local governments within their respective metropolitan areas, Brisbane became the first city in Australia to appoint a city planner and create a town planning department in 1925. Nevertheless, despite powers to prepare planning schemes being granted in 1926, a planning scheme was not gazetted for the city until 1965, due to numerous obstacles. The first town planning ordinances were gazetted in 1926, fixing a minimum lot size of 24 perches, or 607 square metres, and requiring developers to gain council permission before clearing trees. A civic survey was conducted in 1928 in preparation for the drafting of a zoning plan. This followed international trends, particularly the proliferation of zoning in the United States. The draft zoning plan divided the city into residential, industrial, and agricultural zones and set aside special areas for noxious industries. It was rejected by the state government for failing to provide adequate compensation to affected landowners. In 1934, Brisbane was declared a very shocking example of town development with little to done to zone, remove noxious trade, plant suburbs, or improve transport. This same year the Queensland government enacted the City of Mackay and Other Town Planning Schemes Approval Act 1934, which set minimum requirements for the creation of local government planning schemes across the state. A 1944 zoning scheme was adopted by council for the orderly development of the city, while preserving its natural beauty by preventing ribbon development, which referred to development along key road corridors. The plan also included a mile-wide, encircling green belt of farms, open space, and parks to separate urban and rural uses. The green belt included Toohey Forest and Mount Coot-Tha, but also the contemporary suburbs like Carindale, Wishart, Parkinson, Algester, and Forest Lake. Note it was estimated that 500,000 people would reside inside the green belt and that private land within the green belt would be gradually acquired by council and held in perpetuity. The green belt was modelled from other overseas jurisdictions, notably London, and the purported benefits included allowing for the improved planning of passenger transport facilities. It's important to recognise that this policy approach occurred at a time when other cities were retrofitting for increased private vehicle traffic. A stark difference arose between cities that remained compact and those that planned around the proliferation of the car, the latter allowing the urban area to expand exponentially. The Lord Mayor stated that the object of the Green Belt was to prevent a sprawling city extending 4 miles away from its centre, but added that he never hoped to see Brisbane proper holding a population of 1 million people. At the time, the future suburb of Acacia Ridge, 13 kilometres from Brisbane's city centre, was considered completely isolated, with the Lord Mayor stating that the cost of supplying services to it would be enormous. In 1952 the council attempted to have the zoning scheme ratified. The version of the scheme presented to the Queensland government in 1952 differed significantly from its 1944 version, as the council had periodically amended the scheme on its own accord through resolutions of council between 1947 and 1952, which technically had no legal effect. The minister ultimately refused to approve the planning scheme, noting a lack of up-to-date data, as the council had not undertaken a civic survey, as well as a failure to provide sufficient commercial and industrial zone land. A civic survey was later compiled in 1950 to 1951. The Green Belt was based on ideas imported from the United Kingdom, and, while they were accepted by professional planners, it was not accepted by the wider public. Reviewing the proposed planning scheme in 1954, the Director of Local Government emphasised that agricultural uses should be protected but questioned the utility of the Green Belt. He stated that the low-density conditions of Brisbane did not fully justify the expense of a mix of public and private land being restricted from development. The Green Belt was abandoned in subsequent versions of the planning scheme, citing no justification, as well as public pressure that the proposal would strangle the development of Brisbane and lead to congestion and slum areas. The association between higher-density housing and slums is still as pervasive today as it was in the post-war period, and these decisions were to set Brisbane on the path of sprawl and car dependence. This time period represents a stark change in Brisbane's approach to planning, which we will explore in Part 2.